Dufu, the 8 formations. Your achievements overshadowed any in the 3 kingdoms. Most famous of all was your design for the 8 formations. Against the river's surge, they stand solid, immovable, a monument to your lasting regret at failing to swallow up Wu. So we continue with the poems in this series, and as was almost inevitable, there is a poem in this section by Du Fu. Remember, Du Fu is the most well-represented poet by far in this anthology. You could say that in almost every section of the book there is at least one poem by Du Fu. Usually more. He's usually the most represented poem in each of the sections he appears. It is significant, though, that in this section, the pentasyllabic quatrain, there's only one poem by Du Fu. I think it was David Hawkes, one famous sinologist, who commented in his little primer on Du Fu that the quatrains were the genre at which Du Fu might be found at his weakest. That's probably because the shortness, the succinctness, of the form rather tends to favor flashy, showy, probably slightly superficial, even frivolous subject matter. You know, the form is too brief to really develop in with any level of complexity and refinement. And Du Fu's reputation mostly relies on the ability in which he is able to create an intricate tracery, an intertwining of cultural, historicist, literary references and quotations, closely connected through his poem to the present, and also with also a very good intertwining of images and structures within the poetic structure of the poem. And again, such a short form does not really lend itself to all this. So, poem by Du Fu, just one in this section. Let's speak a little bit about it. The title, The 8 Formations. So, this poem is allegedly connected to, we could call it a monument or a landmark of sorts. So in the upper area of the Yangtze River, an area through which we know Du Fu passed, there is this, or there was until recently, this is a place pretty close to modern Chongqing. So there was there until recently, as I said, a group of large stones that stood on the shore of the Jiangsu River. At low tide, they were visible. It's not clear what the origin of these stones is, but probably there were some sort of megalithic, maybe Bronze Age or Neolithic construction of some local culture. But the tradition associated these rocks, these 8 formations, with the 3 kingdoms general Zhuge Liang. We've talked a lot about General Zhuge Liang. He was a hero of sorts for Du Fu, and he represented the man that was needed at the time of the Alishan Rebellion. He had been a genius, a great minister and military strategist who had helped the sinking house of Han to at least retain one of the 3 parts in which China was carved at the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty. And he had plans for reunifying the kingdoms under his ruler Liu Bei, and allegedly these stone outcrops in this area that were later called the 8 formations were allegedly part of a physical construction of a battle formation that Zhuge Liang had planned to use in his decisive battle against the kingdom of Wu. That battle was never to take place. The troops of Shu Han were defeated by the troops of Wu, and afterwards had to ally themselves, I think, with the troops of Wu against the greater state of Cao Wei, which they defeated, managed to gain a certain lease of life. But anyway, that would explain this monument, and you could say the topic of this poem. I would say there are 2 topics, or there are 2 ways of describing this poem. On the one hand, it's a landmark poem, as it's describing this landmark that Du Fu would have seen and would have visited when he passed through the upper course of the Yangtze. On the other hand, it's obviously historical poem in homage to General Zhuge Liang. And remember, we've read at least 2 or 3 poems in this anthology by Du Fu about Zhuge Liang, in which he wrote while passing through different temples and sanctuaries devoted to this great war hero, which incidentally had been, even before the An Lushan rebellion, he had been canonized in a way by the Han and by the Tang dynasty. As they had built temples, just like there were the Sibyl temples to Confucius, which were the center point of the state cult to Confucius and of the scholar officials. The Tang dynasty also tried to create an equivalent for the military officials, which also passed examinations. And they had temples devoted not to Confucius, but to Zhuge Liang. So he was, a cultural, symbolically loaded figure, not only for Du Fu, but also for all the Tang dynasty. And again, after the An Lushan rebellion, it was pretty evident that a figure like him, an extinguisher of fires who could prop up the falling dynasty, would be the man that the times seemed to require. So this poem describes the 8 formations, describes that landmark, and also sighs, longs, praises this great figure of the past, Zhuge Liang. So let's take a look at the 4 lines at the 2 couplets. First couplet. Your achievements overshadowed any in the 3 kingdoms. Most famous of all was your design for the 8 formations. So the first couplet is an unabashed couplet of praise to Zhuge Liang, just as I said, in some of the poems by Du Fu that we've encountered previously, we also had some equally unashamedly examples of lines of praise to this great general, to this great figure. And he is the greatest hero of the 3 kingdoms, the first line says. I mean, nobody was as successful as you were. This could be arguable, perhaps in propping a falling house, but you could argue that the main general and founder of the Cao Wei state, Cao Cao, was probably as interesting or more than Zhuge Liang. Definitely a better writer. He was a poet apart from being an empire builder and a successful military general, but he has been vilified by the Chinese cultural tradition. Basically, there were other texts, but the novels of the Ming Dynasty, the Romance of the 3 Kingdoms, and the Chinese opera has contributed to vilifying Cao Cao. But we're talking. That's the topic for another day. So first couplet praises Zhuge Liang. His achievements were greater in the voice of the poet, in the opinion of the poet, of any of the other famous figures of the 3 Kingdoms period, and his greatest achievement was his design for the 8 formations. So here we might imagine a possible double interpretation for here. It would not sound completely realistic to believe that the rocky outcrop that Du Fu is looking at is the greatest achievement of Zhuge Liang. He's probably thinking of the strategy which underlies these rocky constructions, and even beyond that strategy, his integrity, his bravery, his skill, his endless efforts in propping up the legitimate house, in defending the right cause. So this design for the 8 formations really acts as a metonymy for his desire, for Zhuge Liang's desire for unifying all of China and for serving the right dynasty and the right ruler. Second couplet. So the first couplet, it's centered on the past and on the image, on the memory of Zhuge Liang and his plans in the past. The second couplet brings us more to the present and to the physicality of the 8 formations. Against the river's surge, they stand solid, immovable, a monument to your lasting regret at failing to swallow up Wu. So, as I said, the second couplet brings us to the present. It brings us to those rocks that constitute the 8 formations. Those how could we expostulate them? Those in theory, it's an arrangement of 64 groups of large stones, although I would be slightly skeptic about such a regular pattern. So rocks represent stability, like mountains in China. They represent the principle of unmovableness, whereas water represents the opposite, the perpetual movement and mining and the success of mining. So the two images are contrasted. The river rises, but the rocks stand solid and movable. So they act very appropriately as a metaphor, again, for those unmovable, loyal feelings of Zhuge Liang. No adversities, no difficulties, nothing, even today, manages to move those rocks. And just as those rocks resist the passage of time and the tides of the waters, so the intentions, the good intentions, the good plans of Zhuge Liang were unaffected by the many difficulties he encountered. And, he's probably trying to extrapolate this sort of feeling probably to himself. Well, remember that Du Fu's most famous poem, which we've read in this anthology, has the most famous line, which says something like, the whole country is in turmoil, but mountains and rivers endure. Like the real essence of the country perdures, the lastingness, the loyal, the landscape, the essence of the nation in all adversity, in all chaos and civil war and dynastic fall is preserved and survives. This culture of ours survives. So there's this positivity of resisting at a time of chaos and trouble and rebellion. And so these rocks resisting the tide are a very good metaphor, not only for Zhuge Liang, but for Du Fu's own troubled times. And they're a monument to the lasting regret of the general at failing to swallow up Wu. So this would be less important. It connects us again with the first two lines. And with Zhuge Liang, like them. They stand as a monument of his virtues and loyalty, also of his failure, of his wish for unifying the three kingdoms, but of his failing to do that. And in this, we might see a closer association between Zhuge Liang and Du Fu himself. I mean, Du Fu, remember, was basically a failed scholar official. He never managed to attain any position of importance. He only served relatively briefly under the imperial court, and then spent the last years of his life wandering all through the west and south and south of China, wandering aimlessly. And like all scholar officials, he would have considered himself probably not too humbly as a person who would be able to do great things and who was not employed. And like Zhuge Liang, he would have shared this feeling of frustration at not being able to do things to prop up the ruling house, which he probably believed were in his power to do. So, short poem, and pretty interesting, at least as an example of Du Fu in a genre that is probably not his strongest, but still he manages to produce an acceptably successful poem from my point of view.